皆様、こんばんは。フィンランドセンター所長のアンナマリア・ヴィリャネンです。よろしくお願いします。And welcome to this interview with Alexander Stubb as a first part of the Finnish Swedish week here in Japan. With me here today, I have Alexander Stubb, and I'm going to have a couple of questions for him. And after these questions and after this video, you have all the time in the world to come with your own questions. Thank you. And let's start with the questions here. Alexander Stubb, very pleased to meet you here today.
Arigato. Watashi no namae wa Alexander desu.
Oh, sugoi. Alexander Stubb, maybe we could start with a very nice warm-up question here. Short presentation of yourself and your background.
Yeah, no, really quite simple. I come from Finland. I come from a bilingual background. Always spoke Swedish with my dad, Finnish with my mom. Started off in a Finnish school, finished high school in a Swedish school, and did all of my studies in English. I originally was an academic, then I moved into civil service and diplomacy. Then I was in politics for the better part of 12 years, ended up being prime minister, among other things. Then I was a banker at the European Investment Bank, and now I'm here, a professor at the European University Institute in Florence.
Excellent, very impressive indeed, and we are so very happy to have you here today despite of a very, very hectic schedule. Now, when talking about the Finnish Swedish week, as I mentioned already, the Finnish Institute in Japan has been organizing these now 3 years in a row, and there's no really end in sight. And what we really want to do here is to introduce the bilingual Finland. And well, then coming to the next question, really, according to you, what is the impact of Swedish in Finland in general first?
Well, I think it's a very positive one. I mean, if you look at it from a historic perspective, of course, you know, for 700 years, Finland was a part of Sweden. You know, I'm sitting in a living room in Florence that was built in 1450. In those days, Finland was a part of Sweden, and Swedish was a very obviously predominant part of the Finnish-Swedish Empire at the time. Then, of course, there was a time in history when we were under Russia from 1809 to 1917, when there was a very strong element of being Finnish. We call it Fennomania in many ways. So you had to show and prove that you knew the Finnish language and the Finnish culture. I happen to be a descendant of Snellman, who was a Finn Swede, but at the same time very strong with the Finnish language. Then there was a period, I think, in Finnish history where Finn Swedes were viewed in a sort of skeptical manner. It was part of the fact that a lot of the aristocracy in the beginning of the 20th century were Finn Swedes and of Swedish descent, and a lot of the wealth was concentrated among Finn Swedes at the time. But nowadays, I would see, you know, Swedish or Swedish speakers as a strong positive force, a positive minority in Finland. You know, of course, you're always going to have people who feel a little bit threatened and their identity and the rest of it. But I would say that for the most part, you know, Finn Swedes are considered to be sort of happy, smiley, and positive Finns.
Yes, thank you so much. Then if we go a bit further, so the impact of Swedish, especially when it comes to culture in Finland.
It's multifaceted. I mean, one part of it is obviously identity and culture. We all have that. It's our own experience of who we feel that we are. The second part is literature. I think the sort of Swedish literature in Finland is quite strong. You know, the likes of Kjell Wester, who is one of my personal favorite authors. Then there's the TV and radio culture, mostly from the public side. So YLE, which is our national broadcaster, has a very strong Swedish element. There's the newspaper element, and there of course we have Hufvudstadspeaking newspapers in Finland. There's a very strong theater scene. I myself am born and raised in Helsinki, the capital of Finland, and we have Svenska Teatern, the Swedish theater. So there's a strong element of that, and then there's culturally also. Obviously, the West Coast is closer to the Swedish language than the East side of our border. There is a very strong cultural link to Sweden, which I think is a really good thing, because I personally think that Swedes are pretty cool, we sort of get along very well, I think. Then of course there's also an element which people don't know very much about, is the Åland Islands in Finland, which are basically Swedish speaking, and became an autonomous part of Finland with a big UN agreement a long time ago. So there are lots of, I think, pretty cool elements. And I must say also there's this sort of youth culture, Finnish Swedish youth culture, which is driven by a radio station called Radio Extreme, and it's kind of quirky, funny. It's not at all snobbish. It's almost self-ironic and quite hilarious in many ways. So yeah, I mean, Swedish speaking culture is quite vibrant in Finland.
Yes, thank you. And by the way, you can just imagine how thrilled I was when I found out that I can actually listen to the Radio Extreme in Japan, in Tokyo. It was like, woo, excellent.
Yes, modern technology, huh?
Yeah, and then another thing, I also happen to know the Åland Islands pretty well, since I'm married to an Åland man since 30 years. So yes,
there you go.
Excellent.
We call it resilience, sisu, grit and perseverance.
Exactly. Yes. Well, then, when it comes to the impact of Swedish still, when it comes to business.
Yeah, very strong. I mean, you have it in a few facets, right? So the first one is what I call the old money. So some of the what I would call immigrant money coming to Finland in the 1800s, early 1900s, sort of big families, not necessarily always Swedish. Some of them, with a German background, like Fazer or Paulig, these types of big industries. One in sort of chocolate and foods, and the other one in coffee. You have Rättig, you have Fiskars, a lot of these. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen the orange scissors, etc., etc. So all of these are inherently and traditionally Finnish Swedish industries. So that's sort of the old money, which has been the backbone or foundation, a lot of the industrial wealth and economic growth. And then there's, to a certain extent, the new side of things. I mean, lots of innovation going on, a lot of startups, and then there's also this element of, I mean, I have a lot of Finnish Swedish friends who went to the Swedish business school, Hanken, in Helsinki, and they've done very well for themselves. But I must add that they've done very well for themselves abroad. So, I have a lot of friends that have done the university, then they've gone to whatever, Goldman Sachs, and moved on into private equity or asset management or running big companies, etc., etc. And then there's also this, people who've gone abroad, studied in Finland, gone abroad, and then come back. So, for instance, one of my good friends, Henrik Ehnroth, is running the Kone Corporation, the ones that make the escalators and elevators. And he's a, Finn Swede who has studied in Finland, then worked in England, and then come back. So you have a lot of movement in all kinds of directions. It's very difficult nowadays to stereotype a Finnish, business leader. But if I stereotype, I say there's the old money, which is great, and then there's the new money. And of course, I, forgot the grand old man of Finnish business, Nalle Wahlroos, a legendary banker who is now doing a few boards in the paper and pulp industry and elsewhere. So, you have a lot of good characters as well.
Excellent. The impact of Swedish still in politics, Alexander Stubb?
Yeah, I mean, it is there. I mean, I remember when I went into politics in 2004, my natural choice was a center-right party in Finland. It happens to be called the National Coalition Party. If it was my choice, it should be called the International Coalition Party. Some Finn Swedes criticized me heavily for not going into what I call the Liberal Linguistic Party, which is the Swedish People's Party. The Swedish People's Party is always there. It sort of targets between 4 to 5% of the vote. And usually it's not a rainmaker, but an instrumental part of any government. As things would happen, I was in a government where the Finn Swedes were not, but they're always there to protect the Swedish-speaking minority. I mean, some would say that they're too much driven by the identity and language question, that they should sort of have a more, how would I say, overall holistic liberal profile. Yeah, perhaps, but I think that would be quite difficult for the party to do. So, we quite often have, and I think for the past 40, 50 years, we've always had the Swedish People's Party in government, apart from 2015 to 2019, when the True Finns were in there. The True Finns, of course, have a rather different agenda from the Swedish People's Party. They often take the position of justice minister or defense minister or both, which I think is actually quite a good thing, because they're a very sensible party. I obviously always had a very easy time cooperating with the Swedish People's Party, not only for linguistic reasons, but also for affinity to, how would I call it, the center-right liberal international agenda.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, there are obviously many minority languages in the world. So why do we need to obtain and defend these minority languages in general, according to you?
Well, I think if you take it from the basic starting point, if you believe in liberal democracy, and here I mean liberal democracy, not illiberal democracy or not democracy, liberal democracy, that usually contains a few basic values like human rights, fundamental rights, freedom, and also obviously equality, but also the protection of minorities, right? So I think the whole basic fundamental foundation of a liberal democracy is the capacity of a society to be set up in such a way that the majority cannot impose their will on the minority, nor can the minority do the reverse. And languages are, of course, a big part of it. So languages are about your identity. They're about who you are as a person, how you communicate, what you do, what your past is, and in many ways, how you think. And because I personally believe in multiculturalism, in other words, bringing in a whole bunch of different cultures, languages, and races, as I think languages are good to help that. And that's why I think it's important that we have, obviously, in Finland, well, 2+1 official languages, Finnish and Swedish, and then Sami. And I'm very proud of the Finnish Swedish heritage that we have as well. I think we would be poorer. We would be more monolithic, more sort of one track if we only had Finnish as a language. Unfortunately, now Swedish has a positive status in Finnish society. There was a time when the status, for one reason or another, was not viewed as positive. But I think with time again, the Swedish language has been integrated into Finnish societal mainstream in the way that it was not, say, 100 years ago.
Excellent. Now, still about the Swedish in Finland from an international perspective, what do you think?
Yeah, it helps, in the sense that, well, obviously in the Nordic context, if you speak Swedish, even if your Swedish is not perfect, I think it works with the other Nordics. Of course, we don't understand the Icelanders, and we fake and pretend that we understand the Danes, but we really don't, because Danish is, and I have a lot of Danish friends, it's Swedish with a hot taste in your mouth. So it's not even a dialect. When I was born, I do remember being in a lot of Nordic Council meetings and sort of faking and nodding when the Dane was speaking and not listening to a translation. And I'd sort of whisper to our ambassador, "What the hell is he or she saying?" But it's important. You can communicate. But for me personally, the Swedish language has been a stepping stone to learning other languages, right? So because I came from a bilingual background, Finnish is a completely different, it's not an Indo-European, it's a Finno-Ugric language. So you can't really build on it in terms of grammar, expression, or vocabulary, where Swedish is closer linked to, say, German, and also much closer to English than what it is to Finnish. So for me, it's been a springboard to learn other languages, French at the end of the day as well. People don't know it, but there are basically 300 words in Swedish that have their root in the French language, again, because of history and the Bernadottes royal family coming from France. So, it's not a bad thing to have that Swedish language there as well. But to be very honest, even in diplomatic circles, you have to quite often explain that Finland is a bilingual country. Our second official language is Swedish. And then you make the comparison and say it's a little bit like Canada or a little bit like Belgium, but there is no belligerence around the language. There are no complexes around the language. It's just part of our identity as Finland.
Excellent. How do you see the future of Swedish in Finland?
I think it's going to be pretty stable. I remember looking at stats, say, about 10 years ago, and I think we were looking at about 80 to 100,000 Finnish Swedish families. So basically, families where one parent is a Swedish speaker and the other parent is a Finnish speaker. And I think that's the future of it. You're probably going to see, what I would call the pure Finn Swedes, contingent coming down to a certain extent. But then the bilingual contingent from which I come myself, basically going up. I'll give you an example from my family. I'm married to a Brit, and my wife picked up Swedish quite early on. Finnish later on, and then now she's a Finnish national. Actually did the Finnish nationality language test in Finnish, though her Swedish is much stronger. So when our kids were born, early 2000, my wife did not speak or understand Finnish. So I decided that in order for my wife to be, or we decided that in order for my wife to be in the communication loop with the kids, I'll speak Swedish to them. So, they are, to a certain extent, Finnish, Swedish, but actually Finnish, Swedish, British of there. And I think we'll see a lot more of this mix as well.
Exactly. Last but definitely not least, a kind of, an easier question. So we here at the Finnish Institute in Japan, we are really having different kind of cultural events during this week. For instance, the crayfish party, that will be the highlight of the whole week on Friday night. But what is your favorite cultural event when we are talking about the Swedish in Finland?
It's really difficult to say. I mean, I must say that our family has a long tradition of crayfish parties. But I'll also tell you that, at some stage, especially when I was in government for 8 years, so foreign minister, trade, Europe, prime minister, and finance minister. And then you look at your agenda and you have 25 invitations to crayfish parties, and you're sort of sorry. So I basically have only one crayfish party a year. And that's a crayfish party that's thrown by my dad to myself and to my brother and our families. So I must say that that's, my favorite kind of a Finnish-Swedish cultural event. This year it took place in the Finnish archipelago, actually on an island whereby one of your colleagues has his place as well. It's called Lilla Svarte, the Little Black Island. And really really enjoyed. But if I may, on the cultural side, when I was here, I was around the world. But if I were to give you one meal which was my favorite in all 8 years around the world in about 100 countries, it was the sushi dinner at the Japanese Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And I think we must have been talking about 2011 or 2012. I forget the year, but I still remember the dinner. And I don't say this only because you have a Japanese audience there. It was just one of these things when, you know, the plates kept on coming and coming and coming. And it was absolutely fantastic. And I'm also a big fan of sushi. So I remember when I landed, our ambassador wanted to take me to an Italian restaurant in Tokyo. And I was going, what, man? I mean, crazy. So we changed it and went to a sushi restaurant. So there you go. Some Finnish and Finnish, Swedish and Japanese culture together. And let me just finish off by saying that I do find it really interesting that there is a close affinity between, you know, Finland and Japan. You know, we're all a little bit shy, sometimes a little bit hierarchical. We're quite respectful. We look at each other's architecture. Well, you know, it's quite similar. We like similar type of colors. So it's a really sort of funny anomaly, and of course Moomins. But you know, so it's a really funny anomaly to have there. But I'm really glad that you're having this event and that you're looking at Finland from a Finnish Swedish perspective as well. So I wish you the best of weeks and a Helangor crayfish party as well.
Thank you so very much, Alexander Stubb. We know that you are very, very busy and we are so grateful that you took this time with us today. And I know that it's very, very dangerous to give any kind of promises, especially online or, you know, when you have all the testimonials and so forth here. But if you come to Japan, so I promise you that the Finnish Institute in Japan will take you for a very, very oishii bangohan dinner with the sushi. Yoroshiku onegaishimasu.
Thanks a lot. Looking forward to it.
Yes. Thank you so much. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.